So let's start with our motivation. Just have a big mind, expand your mind to fill the entire universe. Recalling that all the stars out there that look so tiny to our eyes are actually enormous. And so the scope of living beings living out in the world system is inestimable. No, those beings have feelings. They want happiness. They don't want suffering. They face all different sorts of situations according to the realms they're born into and the situations within those realms, all being a ripening of their own karma. So here's this enormous mass of living beings, all of them who are exactly like us, wanting happiness and not suffering, all of whom have been kind to us in previous lives and will be kind to us again in the future. And so we're connected to all of them, whether we know them in this life or not, no matter what our relationships were. There's this connection between us. And so let's care about them and their experience. Not tune them out as if they were inconsequential. But really wish them well and make a determination to do what we can to be a benefit to them. And since the greatest benefit is to be able to lead them out of cyclic existence, and the best way to do that is if we are also free of cyclic existence and have all the qualities of a fully enlightened one. And let's generate that aspiration to attain full awakening, no matter how long it takes. And so to have joy in our mind about doing something that's really worthwhile and make that the center of our lives. Okay, so since the other computer was small and the pages weren't turning properly, I decided to use this big one. So we'll play peekaboo sometimes. where were we? As I remember, what statements of pervasion imply? Is that where we were? Okay.
We ended with all the cat.
All the cat stuff, yeah. Okay. So this next section, and the rest of the chapter, it can seem quite complicated. And I think he realizes that because the exercises he puts in are just asking us to observe in our own life the different way that people say things. So, and he also says he doesn't expect us to understand everything. So we'll do our best and not get weighed down. Okay. So remember, he was saying that there's statements of qualities and statements of pervasion. Yeah, and with the qualities, the subject was either a singular abstract or a singular concrete object. And with statements of pervasion, and also that the quality pervaded the collective, the whole thing of the subject. With the pervasion, the thing that is pervading is distributive, yeah, and it applies to all the things that could be the subject. Okay, so the statements of qualities, when you form a pervasion, when you form a syllogism, are seeing if the reason applies to the subject, and the statements of pervasion in the syllogism are seeing if it's the reason, is it the thesis or the predicate, actually. Okay, so we'll get into that more, but that's just trying to say that he's giving us background information for making a syllogism. Okay, so what statements of pervasion imply? So statements of pervasion imply other statements of pervasion and statements of qualities. Okay, so first topic is statements of pervasion imply other statements of pervasion. By performing mere mechanical transformations, we can precipitate several statements from any statement of pervasion that must be true if the initial statement is true. For instance, take our standard, all P's are Q's. Or, to put it in another way, if it's a P, it's necessarily a Q. Or whatever is a P is necessarily a Q. Different ways of saying the same thing. And the example, all cats are mammals. Okay, really thrilling. It grabs you. Yeah. And then by a process called obversion, in which the qualities of this positive sentence, all, is changed to the negative, no, the subject remains the same in both statements, and the predicate becomes the contradictory of the original predicate. This statement implies, and what we're basically doing here, if all P's are Q's, you add a no to this side and you add a no to that side, and it still works. So no P's are non-Q's. No cats are non-mammals. Okay? So the all is changed to the negative no. The subject remains the same in that You don't move the placement of the P's and the Q's. And the predicate, which would be the second half of it, becomes the contradictory of the original predicate. Basically, that to me sounds confusing. What he's saying is you add a no to the first part and you add a no to the second part. So it's like in math, if you times each side by the same number, it still remains the same. Okay, so no P's are non-Q's. No cats are non-mammals. Yeah. So if it's not a cat, it's a non-mammal. If it's not a cat, that doesn't work, does it? Yeah, but if you want to put it in an if statement, yeah. Whatever is not a cat is not necessarily. Okay, let's skip that. Okay, I like the statements if, that start with if rather than, like this. Anyway, taking the immediately preceding statement, no P's are non-Q's, and changing it by a process called conversion. So the first one was obversion. Now you have conversion, in which we simply reverse the order of the subject and the predicate. Okay, so P, Q, you do that. Okay, so the inverted statement would then be no non-Q's are P's. So you leave the no, and no P's are non-Q's in place, and you just switch the two things. So no non-Q's are P's. No non-mammals are cats. No non-mammals. No non-mammals are cats. That's correct. Okay. Even though the process of aversion works for all types, all four types of categorical statements. Did I miss something? What are the four types of categorical statements? Pardon? Yeah? I'm going, I went back to the beginning chapter. I didn't see four categorical types of categorical statements. I thought maybe, well, it looks like nobody has. Okay, so we'll keep going. So aversion works for all those four, whatever they are. Okay, but understand if you find out. Yes?
I think it means that when you've got the two parts of the sentence, that it's either positive or negative, and then positive or negative. So then there's four possibilities. I think.
Yeah, but
that makes sense.
Yeah, but no, anyway. Yeah, what would they be? What would those four be like then?
Because it's only the process of aversion he's talking about.
Yeah.
If you search it, it doesn't seem to ever explain it.
It would be a P and a Q, a P and a non-Q.
Yeah, but you have to make them into statements. You can't just say P and Q. Are you saying all P's are Q's, all P's are not? Yeah. Anyway, think about it, okay? And if you can figure it out, let the rest of us know. Yeah, because it has to be a statement. It can't just be combinations of four things. Okay, or two things. Okay, understand clearly that the process of conversion works for only two of the four. Thus, conversion cannot always be applied safely. That is, the truth value is not always preserved when you convert a statement, so only certain types of statements can be converted into an equivalent statement. For example, if we try to convert our standard all cats are mammals, we would get the false statement, all mammals are cats. So be cautious. Now, how is that converting it? Okay, so conversion, you simply reverse the order of the subject and predicate in the obverted statement. Okay, so no cats are non-mammals would be no non-mammals are cats. And he's changing the no non-mammals are cats to mean all mammals are cats. He's putting the double negative together to make all. But to me, it sounds very different if you say no non-mammals are cats than if you say all mammals are cats. Okay. Finally, taking the immediately preceding statement and changing it again by obversion. I'm curious if this thing of obversion and conversion comes in Western philosophy. Does anybody know? Okay, because it would be interesting to see if he's trying to make this fit into a Western framework or not.
Is he trying to set up counter-pervasion?
Well, that's what he's trying to get to, but there's such an easy way to get to counter-pervasion that I'm not sure why he's going through all of this. That's why, I'm wondering. Yeah. Okay, so you take, finally, taking the immediately preceding statement and changing it again by obversion, then you get, so you had no non-Q's or P's, and to change that by obversion, you're going to add a no to no sides. So it would be no, non-Q's are not P's. Okay, and so he's changing that to all non-Q's are non-P's, putting the double negative together. It is easier for us to hear this when it is stated as, if something is not a Q, then it is necessarily not a P. Thank you. That is understandable. If something is not a mammal, then it is necessarily not a cat. Great. Okay? The result of the last step is called the contrapositive of the original statement. You can move directly, this is what we want to do, from the original to the contrapositive by what is called the law of the contrapositive. The two earlier steps are indeed logical implications of the original pervasion, and they would routinely be considered in the process of comparing phenomena. But generating the contrapositive directly from the original statement is a standard part of the process of inference itself. Simply put, okay, you switch the places of the P term and the Q term and negate them both. Okay, you can do this because the contrapositive and the original statement are logically equivalent. One is true if and only if the other is true. So forming the contrapositive is a handy tool. Okay, so, yeah, the person is empty because of being a dependent arising. So what's the pervasion in that statement, in that syllogism? We have the syllogism. A person is empty because of being a dependent arising. Yeah, if it's a dependent arising, then it must be empty. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Then the contrapositive is, because you have, I'm going to do it your way. The person is empty because of being a dependent arising. Okay? So if it's the reason, dependent arising, then it's going to be the predicate. Yeah? The contrapositive is you just switch those two around and say no to both of them. So if it's not dependent arising, if it's not empty, then it's not a dependent arising. Is that true or not true? If it's not empty, it's not a dependent arising. That's true, isn't it? Okay. So that's all the contrapositive is. Yeah. Is you just took, you have your subject, your predicate, the reason. Yeah. The pervasion is if it's the reason, it's the predicate. And so you have to test if that's true. Yeah. And then the contrapositive is turn those two and negate both of them. If it's not empty, it's not dependent arising.
Why wouldn't you say if it's not a dependent arising, it's not empty? Because you switch them.
Yeah, because you always start here. You switch them. So if it's not empty, then it's not a dependent arising. Okay. So in a syllogism, when you're testing to see if a syllogism is true, they always say there's three modes, or there's three criteria. The first one is that the reason applies to the subject. So, the person, is a dependent arising. Yeah, dependent arising describes person. That's okay. And then, if it's a person, if it's dependent arising, it must be emptiness. That's the pervasion. And then they say the third criteria is the contrapositive. If it's not empty, then it's not a dependent arising. But the thing is, since the original pervasion and the contrapositive, if one's true, the other's true, when you're testing, you don't, to see if the syllogism is valid, you only really need to test to see if there's a pervasion. You need to test to see if the reason applies to the subject. But then after that, just if the pervasion holds, you don't need to do the contrapositive, because if the pervasion's true, the contrapositive is true. Okay, so maybe we should, I drew some examples here. Yeah. So in the case of our thing, the person is empty because of being dependent arising. Dependent arising, is let's say the P, and empty is the Q, and these two things are mutually inclusive. Okay? So you can see in your diagram, if it's a P, it's going to be a Q, and if it's not a Q, it's not going to be a P, because non-Qs are out here, and that's the same. Okay? If you have something like mutually exclusive, what would be a syllogism? The person is impermanent because of being non-existent. Great syllogism. Okay. First of all, does the reason apply to the subject? The person is impermanent because of being non-existent. The reason doesn't apply. Okay? So the person is impermanent because of being non-existent. You know, if this one's impermanent and that one's non-existent, actually non-existent, yeah, and that's non-existent. If it's non-existent, is it going to be impermanent? No. Yeah. And so similarly, if it's not impermanent, it's not going to be non-existent. You know, it's going to be not non-existent. So existent. Okay. So what we're getting at is just trying to help us understand how the syllogism works, how these pervasions work. You had a question?
No,
I googled the categorical statements, and it's the example given. I don't remember the term, but the example given vaguely reminds me of my logic class. So the four that they said is the universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. So the first one is all S are P.
All what? All
S are P.
All S.
Yeah, I think S is subject and then predicate.
Okay.
And then the second one is no S are P. The third one is some S are P. And the fourth one is some S are not P. So it's I vaguely remember this from long ago.
Okay.
I don't remember this term categorical statement.
Yeah. How did you find it? Did you look it up in his index here?
No, just Google.
Oh, you Googled the
It's
term
logic-
categorical statement.
It's, I think, the first few lessons of logic.
I see. Okay. Yeah, so I think he must be trying to relate this to Western style logic. Yeah.
also,
Mm-hmm.
I looked up obversion, and that's also a traditional logic term. And it's
yeah.
something that he said in the book.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so I think he's trying to explain some of these things in terms of Western logic too. Yeah. Okay. So it happens quite often in ordinary conversation that people fail in their efforts to generate the contrapositive correctly. You might think that this is an exaggeration, but just listen like a spy and you will hear it. It would be difficult to make this mistake with cats and mammals, but here it is how it would go. Someone says all cats are mammals, and another person responds, no, there are mammals other than cats. As if you had said, not only that all cats are mammals, but also that all mammals are cats, which you didn't say. Okay. That is true enough, but the full implication of the person's original pervasion is for everything that is other than a mammal, in that range of things, you will find no cats. Okay? That is the correct application of the contrapositive. Okay, so all mammals are cats, then the contrapositive would be, if it's not a mammal, it's not a cat. And to say it in more complicated language, for everything that is other than an mammal, in that range of things, you will find no cats. Okay. So he's giving all these different ways of saying the same thing, personally, I find it a bit confusing. I like the simple, if it's this, then it's necessarily that. Yeah, but I can see the purpose of learning different ways of saying the same thing. Yeah, usually when you're debating, you just use the very simple pervasion. You don't use all this complicated stuff. Okay? So that is the correct application of the contrapositive. Here are some other ways of expressing the contrapositive of the original pervasion. All P's are Q's. All cats are mammals. So just some other ways. If something is not a Q, then it is necessarily not a P. So that's the contrapositive. If something is not a mammal, then it is necessarily not a cat. Okay? Another way, if it is not a Q, then it is not a P. If it is not a mammal, then it is not a cat. That's so easy to understand. Third one, no non-Q is a P. No non-mammal is a cat. Okay? So these all mean the same thing, but some ways of putting it are easier to understand than other ways, aren't they? Okay. Non-Q implies non-P. Non-mammalness implies non-catness. Yeah. Every occurrence of something that is a non-Q is also an occurrence of a non-P. Every occurrence of something that is a non-mammal is also an occurrence of a non-cat. Yeah. And it is not a P because it is not a Q. It is not a cat because it is not a mammal. Okay, so all those are saying the same thing. They're just different ways of saying it. And I think he's giving all of these things because he's asking us in our daily conversation to listen for these kinds of things. Have any of you been listening for this? I haven't. Have you? You have?
I listened to your words, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. No, but in our ordinary conversations, no. So he's asking us to listen to these things. Okay. Then, so before we had statements of pervasion imply other statements of pervasion. Now, second topic is statements of pervasion imply statements of qualities. Okay, so how do we know that a pervasion works? We test pervasions by looking at cases. So here's where we get specific. If someone says that every P is a Q, we will wonder whether or not there is something that is a P that is not a Q. Could there be a cat that is not a mammal? No. Okay, so that pervasion looks good. What this process of verification shows is that statements of pervasion imply statements of qualities. The statement of pervasion, whatever is a cat is necessarily a mammal, implies your cat is a mammal, my cat is a mammal, your mama's cat is a mammal, a lion is a mammal, a tiger is a mammal. Those last two I'm not so sure about. Is a lion a cat? Depends how you define cat. Yeah. When we say we have 4 cats here, I don't think anybody thinks we have 4 tigers or 4 lions. Okay? So you have to, define your terms as well. Okay, and so on. Every cat is a mammal. Thus, the statement of pervasion should be understood as saying, for anything at all that has the quality of a P, that thing will also have the quality of a Q. For example, for anything at all that has the quality of being a cat, that creature will also have the quality of being a mammal. Okay? So, can somebody give some other ones? Some pervasions that work? Besides, if it's a dependent arising, it's empty. That's a whole syllogism. But the counter pervasion would be, if it's a product, it's permanent. Yeah, sound is impermanent because it's a product. The pervasion is, if it's a product, then it's going to be impermanent. Yeah. Okay, so that works. So in that one, your predicate and your reason are mutually inclusive, but also for a pervasion to work, it could also be this. Yeah, where your subject is the small circle, and the reason is the bigger circle. No, that's talking about the applying the if the reason applies to the subject. But it could, another way could be for the pervasion that actually, yeah, the predicate would be the larger one and the reason would be the smaller one.
If it's a nun, it's necessarily a woman.
If it's a nun, it's necessarily a woman.
So
okay.
Take Venerable Java, she's a woman because she's a nun.
Okay, yeah. So then nun would be the P, but we're saying, and then woman would be the Q.
And you say if you practice the Dharma, you become Buddhist?
You have to have you can say, if you practice, so, and you'd have to word it, anybody who practices the Dharma will become, is someone who, how would you say that?
She will become a Buddha because she practices the Dharma.
Okay, so you're making it into a syllogism. Venerable Pema would become a Buddha because she practices the Dharma.
If you practice the Dharma, you will necessarily become
Yeah, is that true? If you practice the Dharma, you'll necessarily become a Buddha? It's not true?
How do you find practice the Dharma?
Yeah. How do you define what does practice the Dharma mean? Okay. But also, somebody could practice the Dharma and become an arhat. Okay. But will they eventually become a Buddha?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But someone could aim for future lives and not necessarily aim for liberation or...
Yeah. But when we say we'll become a Buddha, what do we mean? Eventually?
But I was talking about the Dharma. Like the definition of something. Sometimes they describe the distinction of something being a dharmic practice is if it's aiming for future lives. So I was thinking, well, someone could practice
not just future lives, liberation or awakening.
Yes, but the demarcation is something dharma.
Mm-hmm. Is whether or not the 8 worldly concerns.
It's aimed at future life. Oh, well, okay.
Or liberation. You can't say, that somebody...
The minimum standard, that's what I was...
Okay, minimum standard, yeah. You got to be specific. Okay. Okay, where were we? Okay, so statements of pervasions that include a negative, right? Not where we were? Yeah. Okay, of course, as Sportin' Life sings in Porgy and Bess, it ain't necessarily so. I think I'm out of it. It's some old musical from our parents' generation. Yeah. And I don't know, but I don't know who Sportin' Life is. You know?
The next line in this song is the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so.
Oh.
It's satirical. He's a poor man down on his luck.
Okay.
It's a satirical song. The man's down on his luck, and the next line he sings is, "If it, the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so."
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'd agree with that. Okay. So of course, sometimes in statements of pervasion, there is a negative of one sort or another. Over the years, students in this course, including myself when I was new, have had some difficulties in assessing the meaning of these pervasions that involve a negative. That's because we're not used to talking with so many negatives. This is in part because these statements are almost always bound to the form of whatever is a P is necessarily a Q. Or if something is a P, then it is necessarily a Q. Whereas these are not always our standard way of expressing the relations between categories in English. So here he's bringing in common conversation again, which sometimes for me makes it more confusing, but you don't have to be confused just because I am. Therefore, it will be helpful to lay out the range of statements of pervasion having a negative, and then provide for each one some more ordinary equivalents in English. Okay? So he's trying to make it more easier to understand. Yeah, by making ordinary equivalents in English. So there are three places where a negative can appear in a statement of pervasion. In the verb, expressed as is not. Okay, so, if it's a cat, it is necessarily a mammal. So you negate the verb. Okay, that's what he's saying. That's one place where you can put a negative in. Is, if it's a cat, it's not necessarily a mammal, which, of course, is false, but he's just showing that's one place you can put the negative. Okay, the second place is in the first clause, the antecedent in a conditional sentence with the P phenomena expressed as not a P. So there it would be like, if it's not a cat, it is a mammal. You just negate the P, okay? Then the third place you can put the negative is in the second clause, the consequent in a conditional sentence with the Q phenomena expressed as not a Q. So if it's a cat, it is not a mammal. Okay, so there are three toggle switches between affirmative and negative, and 2 cubed is 8. So there are 8 possible scenarios. Okay. The first of these has all 3 toggles in the affirmative. If it's a P, it is a Q. That's what we've been working with. And that has been already covered. All the other 7 have a negative somewhere. The table that follows shows all 8 together. Okay. So I can't get the table and the explanation on the same page.
Page 91.
Okay.
Or 92.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so going over the table box by box, we can assess some things about how statements of pervasion would normally be expressed in ordinary English. Okay. What is ordinary English? Yeah, it is not the occasion that if something is blah, 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 who talks like that? You know? So the statement in box 1, a statement of the form, whatever is a P is necessarily a Q, has already been explained in full. So we got that one. Okay, box 1. Yeah. Then in box 2, we have a perversion of a pervasion. Yeah, we have a perversion. We have a pervasion. In the form of whatever is a P is necessarily not a Q. So you're negating the second part of it, okay? By a process of simple conversion, by simply trading the places of the P phenomena and the Q phenomena, we get the statement, no Q is a P, which is equivalent to the pervasion, whatever is a Q is necessarily not a P. Okay, need some time to think about that one. Okay, so he's bringing in conversion here, where you switch the P and Q around, and do you negate one of them or not? Let's go back. Conversion. We simply reverse the order of the subject and predicate, so there's no further negation in it. Okay. So we start out with whatever is a P is necessarily a Q, okay, which is this pervasion is the equivalent of the standard English, no P is a Q. Okay, that makes sense. By the process of simple conversion, by simply trading the places of the P phenomena and the Q phenomena, we get the statement, no Q is a P, which is equivalent to the pervasion, whatever, oops, this one changed too, is equivalent to the pervasion, whatever is a Q is necessarily not a P. Okay, yeah, and trying to make it simple, it's becoming more complex, isn't it? Yeah, we're talking about box 2. Yeah. But it starts out, whatever is a P is necessarily not a Q. And then he's having us do the conversion. Why? I'm not sure. But we're trading the places. So we get the statement, no Q is a P. Okay? Which is equivalent to the pervasion, whatever is a Q is necessarily not a P. So he's giving all these different ways of saying the same thing that makes us more confused. Okay?
It's showing that conversion works on that particular one.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't work on some of them.
Mm-hmm. But he's not giving an example. So we can't really say that it works or not works because he has to give the example first. Yeah, and you have to look in the box and see. Yeah, but just by the description alone, we can't see that. He hasn't. That comes later in the paragraph. Okay, so whatever is a Q is necessarily not a P. If it is true that no P is a Q, then it has to be true that no Q is a P.
No cat is a reptile, no reptile is a cat.
Okay. But I'm thinking of the contrapositive. No P. Okay, anyway. This is not just reading back into the statement from the clear knowledge that no cat is a reptile and no reptile is a cat. Rather, it is part of the logic of this type of pervasion. However, understand clearly that not every true statement of pervasion can be converted to yield another true pervasion. That's why we need the example. Okay, for instance, the conversion of the true statement, all cats are mammals, is all mammals are cats, which is not true. So be careful about conversions. I'm not sure exactly why he brought that up. Maybe it's just to show different, I think it must be to show different ways that you can say the same thing. Okay, in box three, whatever is not a P is necessarily a Q. Okay, so whatever is not a cat is necessarily selfless. Okay, that's true. Okay, so in box 3, we have a pervasion of the form, whatever is not a P is necessarily a Q. This sort of pervasion is tricky. Simply knowing that something is not a P does not tell us very much. It is easy to say, for instance, when both parts have negatives, that whatever is not a mammal is necessarily not a cat. But what can be given as an affirmative in the Q position merely from the fact that something is not a Q, not a P, or not a cat? It is negative information that yields little positive insight. Imagine this snippet of conversation. What did you give her? Answer, I did not give her a cat. That actually says a lot, especially if she has cat allergies. What would you know from that? A lot. Yeah, but he says, certainly not what was given. Yeah, so knowing what was not given is a good piece of knowledge. Yeah, but it's not knowing what was given is his point. Not even that anything was given at all. Even so, no matter what, if something is not a P, whatever it is, whether what remains is existent or not, it is selfless. Remember that the selfless is the most comprehensive category of all, including both all existence and all non-existence. So whatever you can imagine that is not a P is still selfless. Yeah, so he's trying to make a pervasion that works here. That's what he came up with. In terms of the boundaries of pervasion, you can think of this as meaning whatever is not a P is necessarily something that may be referred to. Something that may be referred to is synonymous with selfless. That's what he means. Okay.
Well, I think the form is tied to the categorical statement.
What do you mean?
These 4 boxes. Because the categorical statement, the first one is.
The categorical statement, the first one is all the subjects are the predicate.
Mm-hmm.
So that corresponds to the box 1. And then the second one is no subject are the predicate. And then the third one is some of the subject are the predicate. And the fourth one is some of the subjects are not the predicate.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the 4 boxes.
Okay. So how does that fit in with the chart here?
So box 1 is
Is
all the subjects are the predicate.
Okay.
And then box 2 is no subject are predicate.
Okay, so that would be whatever is not a P is necessarily a Q.
Whatever is a P.
No, what was the second one? Whatever is not the subject is the...
No subject are the predicate.
Okay, so no subject is the predicate. That would be...
Whatever's a P is
That would be Q. That would be number 3, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
No cat is a reptile.
Yeah.
No cat is necessarily not a reptile. So the subject is not.
But isn't no subject is the predicate? Isn't that what number 3 is saying? Whatever is not a P is necessarily a Q.
But she was still on number 2. She was just saying whatever is a subject is not necessarily a predicate.
Oh, I heard her negating the P part.
No subject are predicate.
Yeah. So you're negating the P. So
So that corresponds to 3.
that corresponds to 3.
3 says if it's not a P, it has to be a Q. But it doesn't say it can't be a Q if it is a P.
So the example this given is, so no cats have 8 legs.
Okay. No cat has 8 legs.
That's the second one. No S is P.
Maybe we should forget those 4 categorical statements. Those are adding more complexity to it. Trying to match it up here because I don't think it's number 2. Anyway, let's see what he has to say here, and then maybe afterwards go back and try and match it up and make examples that might work. But the whole thing here is when we're giving the things, not all of we're treating it as if every example is going to be true, and that's not the case. Okay. Okay. So, as mentioned in the note to this table, although it seems that the pervasion statement in box 3, whatever is not a P, is necessarily a Q. Whatever is not a cat is necessarily selfless. Is true, it would seem that this pervasion could never be part of a valid syllogism. This is because the P phenomena, non-cat, would not be found exclusively in the similar class of the selfless, but would also, at least in theory, be in the dissimilar class of the non-selfless. Of course, according to the Buddhist presentation, the non-selfless could not possibly exist because all things existent and non-existent are selfless. So is the non-selfless among non-existence? Okay, this is a quandary, maybe a logical paradox. Think more on this point when you read chapter 6, the Buddhist syllogism. Okay, so he's still on 3. So of course, for the box 3 form of statement of pervasion, you can play some tricks, such as saying, whatever is not a cat is necessarily a non-cat. But that reveals very little. Also, there is the question about whether or not is necessarily a non-cat is affirmative since it confirms a negative phenomena. A better use for this form is to use qualifiers that limit the scope. For instance, whatever existence is not a permanent phenomenon is necessarily an impermanent phenomena, instead of saying, like, whatever is not a permanent phenomena is necessarily an impermanent one. Okay, so that whatever existent is not a permanent phenomena is necessarily an impermanent phenomena. That is true enough, and it yields some information. This approach can prove useful. In case you wonder, an impermanent phenomena avoids the fault of non-cat mentioned above, because it is considered a positive phenomena, even with the im in impermanent. Okay, so what he's saying is the term impermanent sounds like you're negating something. You're negating permanent. But he's saying that that's not a negative phenomenon, that impermanent is actually a positive phenomenon, even though the way the word itself is put together makes it look like you're negating permanent. Yeah?
So you have to affirm things in a syllogism? You can't have negatives?
No, you can have negatives. Yeah, I mean, this is all about statements where there's negatives. Okay. So, of course, yeah, okay, we did that. So let's go on to box 4. Okay, so box 4 in the chart. Whatever is not a P is necessarily not a Q. Whatever is not a mammal, so now he's making the P the mammal. He's switching them. Whatever is not a mammal is necessarily not a cat. That's true enough. Okay, so in box 4, we have a pervasion of the form, whatever is not a P is necessarily not a Q. Remember that correct pervasions can only be of 2 profiles. The P phenomena in the first clause and the Q phenomena in the second clause are mutually inclusive. Okay? Or the P phenomena and the Q phenomena compare as 3 possibilities, like this. I find the diagrams very helpful, to tell you the truth. They simplify things in my mind. Okay? So the P phenomena and the Q phenomena compare as 3 possibilities, such that the P phenomena is smaller in extent than the Q phenomena. The sort of pervasion as shown in box 4 can work for both of these. For instance, what is not a cat is necessarily not a feline. Okay? So there, the cat and feline are mutually inclusive. Okay? Or whatever is not a mammal is necessarily not a cat. And that one is 3P, with mammal being the bigger category and cat being the smaller one. Okay, then box 5. Now he's putting the negative in with the verb. Okay? What time is it? We're getting... Do you want to stop now and then do the negatives next time?
Let's just finish the whole chapter and be out of it.
Oh, shall we push on and finish the chapter?
Sorry, I am missing something really obvious. Why in box 4 does he all of a sudden switch to mammal being a P?
Because he just needed an example that would work. So don't think that P always means cat. Okay. Yeah. Pee can also mean dog. And cat can also mean poo. Okay, so let's stop, and then next time we will zoom through the rest of the chapter. Okay. Were you a professor of logic, or
No, unfortunately, this is no.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I only took it in summer school. Philosophy 101 in summer school. That was it. So you can figure all this out, okay? And then explain it next week. but you remember it better than I did. It was longer ago for me.
So where do we end up at box 5? We haven't done yet?
Yeah, we're at box 5. Okay? Oh, to talk about bodhicitta tomorrow morning. Yeah?
So is this all going to be on television? Then I can see the next episode?
Yes, yes. And it gets more confusing when you start negating the verb. It gets even more confusing, as far as I'm
So
concerned.
this is not on television?
No.